Hi, I'm Jake, and today I'd like to talk about what it means to be a modern day evangelist. So, at its core, evangelism is pretty much preaching the gospel. Now, this is something that every single Christian should be doing. Uh, Now, this doesn't mean that every Christian is going to be preaching up on a stage, on a pulpit, in front of, dozens, hundreds, thousands of people. What this means is in your everyday life, you should be preaching the gospel or telling people about Jesus when the opportunity presents itself. Now, there is a specific role that is an evangelist, and we find out about this role in Ephesians 4. So we know that evangelism is roughly translated as preaching the word, but there's a specific role referenced in Ephesians 4, verses 11. I'm going to read 11 through, I think, 14 here. So I'm reading out of the HCSB version. We're talking about Jesus here when we're seeing the he, and he personally gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers, for the training of the saints in the work of ministry to build up the body of Christ, until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of God's Son, growing into a mature man with a stature measured by Christ's fullness. Then we will no longer be little children, tossed by the waves and blown around by every wind of teaching, by human cunning with cleverness and the techniques of deceit. This is what a lot of people will call the fivefold ministry. Now, this is something that you'll see taught in many different ways, but the way I'm interpreting this is all five of these roles are for today. Um, a lot of people will take the position of pastor and teacher and bunch them into one. My argument is that you can have a pastor, and that pastor has to be a teacher. There's very little circumstance where you're going to find a pastor that isn't teaching something about the Bible. If you don't have a pastor that's teaching about the Bible, then there's probably something broken there. Whereas you can have a teacher, someone with an inherent gift of teaching, yet they aren't qualified or called to be a pastor. So I think there's a distinction between those two roles. The distinction of an apostle and a prophet, those are mentioned multiple times throughout the Bible. However, the evangelist, it's not a word used very many times in the Bible, and it really only refers to one or two people. You see Paul telling Timothy to fulfill the work of an evangelist, and you see that Philip was referenced as an evangelist. So not a ton of them being referenced in the Bible, but right here, there is a specific role for an evangelist. So I'm painting a picture of the modern day evangelist, and this is what I grew up knowing as an evangelist. It's a man that will come to town. He's traveling around. He'll either set up a tent or he'll start a revival. He'll be called by your pastor or your board to, hey, come in. Let's bring in an evangelist for a revival. He'll come in, do the revival, do the tent meeting, and then when that is over, he'll pack up his bags and then go to the next town. And that is what I knew of an evangelist. Evangelists focus on specifically the Great Commission is found in Matthew 28, going to the nations and preaching the gospel, winning souls, seeing souls saved. Also, a lot of them will focus on healings and signs and wonders. And while that is all good things, what I see here in Ephesians 4 is the specific role of the evangelist is for the local church. So as we read verse 12, all of those roles are for the training of the saints in the work of ministry. So those roles train saints to do God's work and to build up the body of Christ. So these people or these roles are to get you to a place where you can work in the ministry and also edify the body of Christ. So basically, you are causing, someone that you're within, that's under your purview, that you're training them up and getting them to a place of maturity so they can do the work. I mean, maturity is mentioned until we all reach unity. Unity is a pretty big deal, as we see in Acts 2. Unity in the faith and in the knowledge of God's Son, growing into a mature man with a stature measured by Christ's fullness. Now, verse 14, this is interesting. Then we will no longer be little children tossed by the waves and blown around by every wind of teaching, by human cunning, with cleverness and the techniques of deceit. So essentially, an evangelist is going to be able to train you to do what an evangelist does, and that is more or less preach the gospel and see souls saved. Now, evangelists in this role might take the pulpit and preach to, dozens, hundreds, thousands, but he can also equip people in the church to reach their neighbors, to reach their family members, to reach their coworkers. And not only that, they're building up the body, they're building up ministries so that these people can be in unity and work together so that they won't be children tossed to and fro by every wind of doctrine, so that these people will have a solid foundation. Long story short, when I read here in Ephesians 4 and about an evangelist, this evangelist kind of has dual hats. This is the person that will be going out and will be preaching a salvation message and will be seeing souls saved. Evangelism has been oftentimes rather comically referred to. If you have a fivefold ministry and you have a hand, your evangelist is going to be the middle finger here, because it's the longest finger with the longest reach. When you're talking about a hand that's moving into an area, the middle finger is the longest one. It's the first one that goes into the dark places. And I believe fully that's what the evangelist does, because the evangelist is going to do a lot of work outside of the four walls of a church, in contrast to a pastor or a teacher who's going to spend a significant amount of time inside the church taking care of a flock, or a teacher, literally sitting in a classroom teaching lessons. Now, all five of these roles in the fivefold ministry are obviously important. You can check down the list and see why they would be important individually. However, working together, you're going to be able to see things exponentially work more smoothly. An evangelist could go out, win some souls. And what's he going to do? Well, he's going to have a backbone right here, a fivefold ministry. So evangelists can say, hey, you know what? Now that you're saved, I'd love for you to, learn a little bit more about Jesus, learn a little bit more about, how the church functions, learn about the Bible. There's lots of key concepts in here. And then you can point them to the teacher, and the teacher can teach. And just like with the pastor, I mean, you need someone that's going to be able to, love on you and shepherd you. Then that's where you want to be able to point them. Just like with the apostle is going to carry around, probably decades of experience, and know what and how churches function, and be able to, lead and guide someone. The prophet is going to be a voice of, prophets all throughout the Bible were voices of reason. They're voices of exposure. They're going to have a certain set of skills where they can see things that other people cannot. And all of these positions can work together to create a backbone that is rock solid, and taking a new immature Christian and turning them into a disciple so that that person can go out and fulfill the Great Commission themselves. Because going and preaching the gospel is, a huge part of what we're supposed to do. Matthew 28 is pretty clear. When Jesus says to go into the nations, he wasn't suggesting it. It was a command. Long story short, when you're referring to an evangelist, not only can it be everyone, because it's all of our duties to evangelize as we go about, because the Matthew 28 commandment, the Great Commission, is for all Christians. But the specific role of an evangelist is someone who can work inside the church, that can build up the church, that creates unity working within a fivefold ministry, so that you can take immature Christians and mature them to a place where they can, be an effective witness themselves. So that is my take on what it means to be an evangelist. Now, how do you get to a place where you have the role of evangelism? Well, that's pretty interesting, because we see here, and he personally gave some to be apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. This isn't calling that Jesus appoints. Not everyone will be called for this specific role. And that's okay, because everyone has specific things, specific skills that they need to be utilizing on their own. Now, being an evangelist, if you are called to do that, is not as easy as it sounds. Because the role of an evangelist is someone who not only has to be able to preach the gospel, but you have to be able to teach others to essentially do the same thing on a different kind of scale. Not only is it your job to see souls saved, and that's something that you would do on your own, it's your job to help create a mature body, a unified body. And it's going to be very difficult to do that, to bring others or help bring others to maturity, if you don't know the word. So all five of those functions are going to be doing the exact same thing, and that's going to be spending a significant amount of time studying, meditating, reading, delving into this book. They're going to spend a significant amount of time in prayer. They're going to understand that these roles are gifts to the church, and yet they still have to remain humble. I mean, we're all called to be like Jesus. Jesus says to follow me, and Jesus was a very humble guy. And even in the midst of everything that he could do, he's God walking on earth, he still remained the Son of Man, and he was very humble about it. And when you tell someone, hey, you know what? You're a gift to the church, that can often create a big head. So don't be that guy. Don't be that guy. Long story short, as I read it, the specific role of an evangelist is someone that's going to not have to go very far outside of their church to have a great impact, because they're building up people as well as expanding their local body. But for me, my evangelism starts oftentimes in the wee hours of the morning with a little bit of prayer, followed by some intense study, followed by a little bit of outreach where I'm actually outside the four walls of a church, and I'm also spending a significant amount of time building up people that feel a call to evangelize themselves, and also doing what I can to build up my local church, so that I can plug people back up into the backbone, and so that my region can be blessed by a plethora of Bible-believing evangelists that just go about their every day doing what I call evangel-living. And that's living like an evangelist, teaching Jesus when they can and when the opportunity arises. And that is my take on how to be an evangelist. So this might be a little bit controversial, and that's okay, because, this is one of those scriptures that I had never really read that often, and never really been presented to me, because it's difficult to wrap your head around what has been decades and decades of evangelists in their RVs traveling around in tent meetings. I mean, that used to be a very popular thing to do. Evangelists traveling around in doing revivals, still relatively popular. But the specific role of an evangelist is someone who builds up and edifies a body, creating mature Christians. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you like this video. If you haven't already, hit subscribe. I got some cool videos coming up. In the meantime, stay blessed.